Can you make sense of this sentence? The price of an ale's mate goes down in places with many low sales. What about this one? The price of an eel's mate goes down in places with many loose eels. I think answers will be a bit all over the place, but generally, as I didn't give any context as to the meaning of the sentence, people will have had a much easier time understanding the second one than the first one. They're the same sentence, of course, but one has the long vowel system of Middle English and the other has the long vowel system of early modern English. The difference between the two vowel systems is something like 200 years. When I do reconstructions of historical stages of English, this is one of the big things that surprises people, the rapid jump in their ability to understand it between about 1400 and 1600. And probably the largest factor in this jump is this change in the qualities of the long vowels, the vowels held for a longer period of time. Historical linguists nowadays call this the Great Vowel Shift. I've made other videos about it going into more detail about why we're so confident that it happened. But even understanding the basic mechanisms of the Great Vowel Shift leaves some questions unanswered, the main one being, did people notice it was happening? And then a lot of subsidiary questions to that. Were they doing it on purpose? What did they think of it? And so on. To a historical linguist, even one unfamiliar with the history of English specifically, the Great Vowel Shift is no great mystery, generally speaking. It's a pretty normal example of a change shift where several sounds within the sound system of a language change in a kind of domino effect. I apologise if you've seen this 50 times before, but it's easiest to see on this diagram of the range of vowel sounds that a human can produce. The starting system, the system of Middle English, has 7 long vowel phonemes, those in place, met, ale, pris, ga, los, and doon, and these vowels all get higher on the chart through the vowel shift, such that they're produced with a slightly higher tongue position, except for the top 2, which were as high as they could be without the tongue actually touching the roof of the mouth, and so they broke into diphthongs or gliding vowels because they had nowhere else to go. This produces a system like place, mate, eel, price, go, loose, and down. Critically, people are still making the same distinctions between words. Place and mate have 2 different vowels before the shift, and they still have 2 different vowels after the shift, place and mate. Speakers are now using different vowel qualities for those words to what they used to use, but they are still keeping a difference between them, and this difference can communicate differences in meaning. This is typical of a change shift, one of those sound changes where lots of phonemes change their sound in a short space of time, with the categorical distinctions between them being maintained. But it's all well and good me saying that it's typical. It might still seem weird that it actually happened. We can imagine it as some kind of abstract systemic thing, but we're talking about real people changing the way they pronounced things here in a systematic way. That doesn't really seem to happen nowadays, does it? So why would it happen back then? If it had happened on such a large scale, why don't we have written treatises explaining to people how to pronounce the new vowels? Why don't we have evidence of the government mandating them, or something like that? Well, the answers can be found by looking at modern systems of pronunciation that we're more familiar with. Bertrand Russell was a respected philosopher who lived between 1872 and 1970. He spoke with a received pronunciation style accent, that posh educated accent that had arisen in the southeast of England, and we have a fairly hefty pile of recordings of his speech. He lived during the era when detailed phonetic descriptions of RP were being made, more or less according to modern transcription conventions. And his accent, I would say, is not atypical of early 20th century RP, although it's maybe a bit more conservative than what you'd find in even out-of-date modern textbooks.
The world is altogether so different from what it was when I was young that it's an extraordinarily difficult thing for an old man to live in such a world.
His front short lax vowels are roughly I, as in since,
Since 1914.
E, as in menace,
Menace, the communist menace.
E, as in can and vanish.
Can, I try as best I can. Vanish, vanish, vanish like morning mist.
So that's I, e, e. So how would we expect him to say this word? Well, we'd expect him to say something like men, and that's what we get.
Men. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing for an old man to live in such a world.
Unfortunately, this recording of Russell is a little bit creaky, so I found cleaner ones of a couple of other southeastern English speakers saying the same sequence of sounds.
Men.
The only problem is, these speakers on the cleaner recordings aren't saying the same word as Russell is.
It's an extraordinarily difficult thing for an old man to live in such a world.
The two men wrestled all through the city streets.
You can only see men.
The way that Russell says this word is almost exactly the same as the way that these more recently born blokes say this word. They're making use of the same tongue positions, the same sounds that a human can produce, but not in the same systemic way. Russell is using that sound for words like men, vanish, and the other blokes are using it for words like men, dress. Presumably Russell would pronounce the vowel in these words with his higher tongue position, e, as in menace, perhaps men, dress. So if you compare Russell's system and this more modern Southern Standard British system, the modern system has this dress, menace vowel substantially lower on the chart, dress, menace. In Russell's older system, this lower position is taken up by another vowel phoneme, the one in men, vanish. So do these modern blokes, including me by the way, have one less vowel distinction than Russell? Do we say dress, menace, men, vanish? No, of course not. We say dress, menace, man, vanish. The two-way distinction has been preserved because the lower of the vowels just sits even lower in our accents than it does in Russell's. For some speakers of modern SSB, the dress, menace vowel is even lower.
Wedding-y dress if you're a woman.
This is something I actually noticed female classmates doing when I was a child in the early 2000s. I didn't obviously have any technical knowledge back then, but I remember noticing some girls saying dress like drass.
Dress.
Of course, Russell was a bit higher than me in the class system, but as my friend Dr. Jeff Lindsay has pointed out in one of his fantastic videos, Prince William, the man who will be king one day, has vowel qualities quite similar to mine, and where they differ from mine, they're actually probably further from Russell's than mine are. This is what Jeff calls the anticlockwise vowel shift, and he's discussed it a little bit on his own channel and in his fantastic book English After RP, which I'd highly recommend. And in terms of its impact on the vowel system, I would say that it's as substantial as the Great Vowel Shift. The vowels are moving by about the same amount, in many cases crossing the vowel space, maybe more than we think the vowels did during the Great Vowel Shift. So if we want an analogy for how the Great Vowel Shift was perceived socially, the modern anti-clockwise vowel shift of SSB seems like a pretty good candidate. So, do we notice? Are we doing it deliberately? These questions have very complicated answers. Nobody from my background would mistake Bertrand Russell's accent as a normal accent possessed by somebody who's now in their 20s. It sounds extremely plummy, extremely old-fashioned. I would be surprised even to meet an 80-year-old who spoke like this nowadays. He sounds like an elderly Eton-educated man from a really old audio recording, which of course is what he is. I don't know if he went to Eton, but you know. I think the average person's perception of the difference would be more demographic than linguistic. You can tell by the way he speaks that he's of a certain generation and a certain social background. An added factor is that we can only hear Bertrand Russell's voice because of old audio recordings. If I'd been raised in a world without audio recordings, I don't think I'd have any model for Russell's kind of accent. I've heard conservative RP so rarely in person that if I met him in a world without audio recordings, I'd probably think English wasn't his first language and that he had a foreign accent. The range of accents that we come across in person is rather more limited, and most of the Southeasterners that I talk to in real life have some degree of anti-clockwise vowel shift, even if older people have it to a slightly lesser degree than I do. But I do meet people with a lesser degree of anti-clockwise vowel shift. My friend Jeff, who I mentioned, and who I hope won't mind me saying is older than me, noted that when he came to the south of England for the first time, he was struck by people saying good rather than good.
I can remember arriving at uni from the north of England, going to London, and I remember my very first days in the Hall of Residence, and I think probably a majority of my peers were from the south of England, and being struck by hearing everybody saying really good, really good. Really good. And why are you talking like that? It just really struck me because, of course, we didn't have YouTube back then. People weren't exposed
really aware of how
to
other
other
people
accents,
spoke, But before Jeff said this to me, I don't think I'd registered that he said the vowel in good any differently to me. He absolutely does.
There are always new fashions for ways of saying good.
But I hadn't noticed. As a speaker further on in the vowel shift and younger than Jeff, I'd been exposed to all sorts of southern-sounding people of his generation saying something like good, that my brain had just neutralised it. I think this is because it has such a strong statistical correspondence with people's age, that if I've already registered that somebody has a southern accent, the only extra thing my brain could learn from that conservative good vowel is that they're probably older than me, and that's usually obvious anyway. So my brain had just chucked it away as extraneous information. As Jeff said, he was probably struck by it because he went from an environment where it was non-existent, Merseyside in northern England, to an environment where it was, I imagine, widespread, London. And so people were speaking in a way he'd never heard before. I've met people with more advanced anti-clockwise vowel shifts than me. The vowels have gone even further around the vowel space. Without any value judgment at all, and just for the sake of some cultural context, my social brain tends to interpret this as sounding feminine. Very occasionally, when hearing sentences with limited context, it's taken me some time to work out what the person has said, if they have a much more advanced anti-clockwise vowel shift than I do. A woman that I knew a few years ago passed another woman in the corridor and said, "She's barefoot." I got confused and thought to myself, she's barefoot in the workplace, before I asked her to repeat herself and worked out that she'd been saying, she's bare fit, a London way of saying she's very attractive. I'd interpreted fit as foot because in some of these accents the foot vowel has centralised and lost a lot of its lip rounding, foot, foot, and the fit vowel has centralised and can gain a little bit of lip rounding in certain contexts, such as after a sound like f that's pronounced with lip closure, fit. At a festival I heard a young lad shout, "We love you, Frank Moody." And in the mess of noise, not knowing what the band was called, I thought he'd said Frank Beanie, until I realised that he had an extremely fronted goose vowel, and I'd misheard the stop sounds because it was so loud, and he'd actually said Frank Moody. Good band, by the way. Looking online, I don't think I'm the only person who, in my day-to-day life, doesn't really notice pronunciation differences, even quite major phonological ones, unless I pay particular attention to them. Recently, Jeff and the phonologist John Harris asked me how I pronounce the words goalie and polar. I pronounce them with different vowels. One has O, goalie, and one has O, polar. O, O. They were very amused by this interesting linguistic specimen because Jeff says goalie, polar, with one vowel for both, and I guess John says something like goalie, polar, also with one vowel for both. I'd never noticed that older people didn't have my pattern of gotalophony, where O becomes O before morpheme final L. And I also obviously hadn't noticed in my childhood that polar has two morphemes, and me not noticing that is presumably why it doesn't trigger the O allophone for me. I've looked up out of curiosity whether Americans with the cot-court merger notice some speakers not having it, and many of them said, "I don't understand, how could you pronounce those two words differently?" despite plenty of public figures and people in old and modern films and people with non-US accents pronouncing them differently all the time. When I was growing up, I noticed that my dad, who's from Northern England, said the vowel in words like strut and cut differently to me, more like strut, cut. But I didn't notice that he said them exactly the same as his vowel in foot and put.
Foot, cut.
Do those words rhyme?
Yes.
I just assumed that his basic system was the same as mine, because why wouldn't it be? So in my experience, the answer is, we kind of notice, but not as much as you'd think. For me, if the differences are strongly correlated enough with someone's age, my brain just filters it out as a factor of their age, and I don't notice the differences at all. If there's a regional component where some regional accents don't have the vowel shift or have a less advanced version of it, we just think of it as a regional accent. And if it's tied to somebody's social class or subculture, we tend to think of it that way, as opposed to as an older or more conservative way of speaking. If we zoom out, the anticlockwise vowel shift is an obvious large-scale systematic change in the average qualities of Southeastern English people's short lax vowels. But it doesn't look like that from the inside. It looks like people from different places and social backgrounds speaking differently because of their regional and social background, and older generations' ways of speaking dying off as the people pass away. All the same things were almost certainly true of the great vowel shift in, for example, London. At any given time, older people might have had a slightly more conservative system, younger people might have been more likely to have a more advanced system, and class, subculture and regional accent would also have been correlated with more or less advanced stages of the shift. At any given time, the difference between oldest speaker alive and youngest speaker alive wouldn't have been much more than 80 years, and people may not have remembered the specific details of their grandparents' accents when they themselves grew elderly, so people's frame of current speech would only ever have represented a fairly narrow portion of a shift that took 200 or 300 years. We actually get a little bit of social commentary from the tail end of the vowel shift around 1600. At this time, for most people in London, the 6 highest Middle English long vowels had come to be something like mate, il, price, go, loose, and down, leaving the lowest vowel, the one in words like face and make, lagging behind. Some people, and we actually have explicit phonetic descriptions by this time, said fas, mak, and some people said face, make. Andre Mazarin, in his fantastic journal article cited here, outlines the commentary of some phoneticians from the time. Alexander Gill, in 1621, criticised some of the fashionable mothers of some of his school pupils who were saying Cambric, capon, instead of Cambric, capon. Other writers of the 1620s argued that the Cambric, capon pronunciation was fine and normal. As far as I know, for the earlier stages of the shift, we don't really have any active commentary. People made spelling choices that clue us into where the shift might have started. My understanding is somewhere in the East Midlands probably, but I'm not aware of any grammarians complaining about it. Even in the modern world, I don't remember hearing anyone actively complaining about the anti-clockwise vowel shift. People complain about language change, but some language change seems to slip below their radar. I'm sure advanced shifted accents annoy some people, but the average person is unlikely to have the vocabulary to describe what about it annoys them, as opposed to a change like th fronting, where people can complain that youngsters are pronouncing th as if it was f. It's an easy thing they can latch onto and describe with no phonetic training. So it may be that we do have records of people complaining about the change, but using very detailed poor terminology, like that person sounds affected, or that person has an annoying voice, rather than anything more specific. Let's imagine a Londoner living in about 1500 who's the same age as me, 27, talking to his grandfather, who miraculously is still alive at 89, and who was born in 1411.
Who's his name said?
Who is his name said? The way any name is spoken with the mouth.
And when he used me mouth to speak his name, who's it spoken?
The same as 'tis written.
This advice helps me not.
Write it down.
Write it down. The name,
Yes, read the name down.
I cannot.
And why not? Speak now, why not?
I cannot write.
Oh, yes, I forgot. You can't not read.
My grandfather could write, and they could not. And he mocked me.
Why did he mock you for such a thing as that?
He know not. He was not proud of many things, but he was proud that he could write.
But you had many things to be proud of, did you not?
He did. But if a man has little to be proud for, he speaks as though he has a lot.
I know men who are, as you say, if I say I cannot smite eels to make eel meat,
You cannot smite eels to make eel meat.
No, I cannot.
Did you meet your grandfather?
Yes, I know my grandfather well.
Was he a kind man?
He was a mercurial man.
What do you mean by saying that?
He could change.
Change?
Yes, he could change on a moment.
What did he do when he changed?
I confided in my grandfather that I could not smite eels to make eel meat, and he laughed.
That's a good tale. But you can smite eels now, can you not? At your advanced age, you can now smite eels to make eel meat.
The last thing I want to do is thank anybody who subscribed to my Patreon and Substack, which makes it possible for me to spend so much time on these videos, and also to say that my friend Miko, who I've worked a lot with on film projects, has recently started uploading YouTube videos again. He's a director and VFX artist, among other things. He's worked on some very substantial projects, Netflix things and so on. And he's been making breakdowns of how he approaches certain VFX shots, which are interesting to me because I always wonder how the hell he does it. And there's also Scott Birchall, my close friend and co-conspirator, who's made videos on various topics of interest I've mentioned before, but I would highly recommend you go and watch those. There's all sorts of things on acting, things on camera equipment, how to get the most out of camera equipment if you don't have enough money for cinema cameras and stuff like that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.